Hey guys, welcome to the video. My name's Carmen and today we are finishing up our seam finishes mini series. Last week we talked about Hong Kong seams, so I'll link that video up there if you want to check that out. Today we're talking about bias bound seams, which is really similar to the Hong Kong seam finish, but it's a little bit easier because there's less steps. So this finish is also really good for jackets. You can use a contrasting fabric for the bias strip that is encasing your seam allowance, so when your jacket flips open, you'll see the pretty contrasting fabric inside the jacket. So let's get started with the tutorial. Okay, so I've got my two pieces of fabric here and I'm going to sew these together with a bias bound seam. So I'm showing you here which sides, the right and wrong sides. So we're going to sew this together with the right sides touching, so the prettier side or the side that you want on the outside of your garment you're going to want touching, and then I'm pinning along the edge that I'm going to sew, and then I'm just going to sew this edge together with a 1/2 inch seam, so using my entire seam allowance. Okay, we're at the sewing machine now, and like I said, I'm going to sew this seam with right sides together, and I'm going to use my entire seam allowance, so in this case a 1/2 inch, but you can just use whatever seam allowance your pattern indicates that you should use. And then after we're done sewing this seam, we're going to take this to the ironing board. So once you sew your seam, it'll look something like this. And now we're just going to press the seam allowances open with your iron. And I really like to press my seam allowances open from both sides of the fabric because I think it just gets a little bit nicer, flatter finish on it. So once we finish ironing our seam allowances open, now we're going to grab our bias tape, and this is double fold bias tape, and you can just buy this at your local craft store. You could also make it if you want to, but this is store-bought bias tape that I'm using here. And then it's pretty easy. You're basically just going to wrap the bias tape around the edge of your seam allowance, encasing the raw edges inside of the bias tape, and then just grab some pins and pin that in place so that it will stay, and then just make sure that you're only pinning through the seam allowance. Make sure that you're not pinning through the main fabric. So that's why I'm lifting up the seam allowance as I pin, to make sure that I'm not going through the main fabric. And then we're basically just going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew the bias tape to the seam allowance with just about a 1/4 inch from the inside edge of the bias tape where the folds are, to hold it all in place. Okay, so I've got my fabric here that we just pinned the bias tape to, and I'm going to fold the main fabric out of the way so that I'm just going to sew through the bias tape and the seam allowance, and I'm just going to sew about 1/8 to 1/4 inch from the folded edge of the bias tape. And the most important thing here is just to make sure that you're catching the underside of the bias tape in your stitching. And once you're done sewing, it'll look something like this. So it's pretty simple, pretty easy to do, and it looks really nice. So now you just need to repeat that same process to attach bias tape to the other side of your seam allowance, and then you're done. Okay, so I got the other side sewn on, and it looks really pretty. It's not quite as clean as a Hong Kong finish, but it's a little bit easier to do, so I think it's a more beginner-friendly way to get into these kinds of really high-end seam finishes. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.